The story begins not with marble temples or noble generals, but with chains clinking in the heat of a crowded square. Rome's slave markets hum with noise, sweat, and the dull resignation of bodies lined up for sale. Think about it. Today, you might scroll through an online store and click Buy Now on a new gadget. In ancient Rome, wealthy citizens strolled through markets and pointed at people real, breathing women as if choosing furniture. The unsettling part? No refund policy if the purchase broke down too soon. Before plunging deeper, there's something you need to do. So before we start, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there. I want to see the spread of this strange little community across the world. As the room softens around you, lean back and allow this story to unfold an experience unlike anything you've listened to until now. The crowd presses in, voices overlap, and the smell of olive oil mingles with dust. A trader drags a woman forward. She's stripped bare, not for comfort in the summer sun, but for display. The Romans believe flaws should be obvious. Scars mentioned loudly. Silence punished with a whip crack on the legs. A placard hangs around her neck, like a cruel advertisement listing age, skills, and a guarantee that she can cook or clean. Imagine job hunting today if resumes were carved onto wooden signs and your failures shouted for all to hear. Slavery is no footnote. At its height, perhaps a third of Rome's population is enslaved. Without them, the empire's machinery collapses. Fields go untended, streets unpaved, villas unpolished. But women carry the double burden, laborers first, objects second. The male buyer doesn't just calculate her value for sewing or cooking, he calculates her body's availability. And since Roman law considers slaves property, her protest means nothing more than a donkey braying in the distance. One odd detail tucked into Roman writings: some sellers rubbed oil mixed with crocodile dung onto a slave's skin, claiming it gave a healthy glow. Historians laugh nervously about this, because it's hard to prove whether the Romans actually believed dung was beautifying, or if this was just another way of mocking the powerless. Either way, remember this: the next time someone tells you about a miracle face cream, it could be worse. Not every transaction is neat. Buyers prod mouths for missing teeth, tug hair to check for lice, and pinch arms to judge muscle tone. Picture a livestock auction, but layered with an uglier truth. Rome's legal system fully condones it. Some scholars argue whether Rome saw this as efficiency or cruelty, but efficiency and cruelty aren't really opposites here. They overlap. A teenage girl, barely past childhood, stands trembling as a buyer considers her. He asks if she can weave. The trader shrugs. If not, she can learn. That shrug, so casual, erases her entire personhood. In another stall, a Greek woman with sharp eyes glares at the crowd. She once recited poetry in Athens. Here, she is just lot number 47. The empire is vast, swallowing lives from Gaul, Africa, Judea, and beyond, spitting them into these markets. The market atmosphere is paradoxical, part business fair, part festival. Sellers bark prices, kids chase each other around the stalls, and the hum of commerce never stops. Somewhere in the background, a flute plays. A Roman matron passes by, buying jewelry, glances at the slave auction, and moves on. For her, it's background noise. For the enslaved women, it's the sound of futures being erased. There's an open scholarly debate about how standardized these markets were. Some argue Rome kept things organized with inspectors ensuring accuracy, while others claim chaos ruled slaves dumped in clusters with little oversight. The truth probably sits in the messy middle. Bureaucrats loved order, but greed loved shortcuts. And then comes the branding. Some owners, eager to mark property, press hot irons against a woman's skin. Letters scar her flesh permanently. No perfume, no fine fabric will cover it. If she escapes, that mark betrays her. Think about social media usernames today, permanently tied to reputations. Rome did it first with fire. Yet among the cruelty lies irony. Wealthy Romans prided themselves on refinement. They quoted philosophers about justice while casually inspecting human merchandise. A senator could spend the morning discussing Cicero's virtues, then the afternoon buying a terrified young woman to scrub his floors. This contradiction, unresolvable, defines Rome. Civilization and savagery dance together, inseparable. By evening, the market slows. Chains rattle as unsold slaves are herded into pens for the night. Somewhere a girl whispers prayers in a language no one here understands. She prays not for freedom too impossible, but for a kinder buyer. It's a prayer she might not get. And as the torches flicker, the crowd disperses, and the city prepares for another day. One question lingers, unspoken but sharp. If this is the beginning of her Roman life, what shadows wait once the market closes and the doors of her new master's villa slam shut? The doors of the villa shut like a verdict. Inside, marble floors gleam and mosaics glitter. But for the enslaved woman, the beauty only sharpens the edge of her new captivity. The grandeur is not for her. It is a reminder that she belongs to the machinery keeping this house radiant. Every polished column whispers the hours of unseen labor, most of it done by hands like hers. Dawn comes early. She's shaken awake before the rooster stirs, ordered to light fires, fetch water, and sweep floors already swept the day before. Domestic slavery is its own battlefield. Unlike the men breaking their backs in fields or quarries, women face endless, thankless tasks where perfection is the minimum. A missed spot of dust? A slap. Spilled wine. A lashing. Too slow. She's dragged out and made an example before the others. Imagine doing a corporate job where the punishment for missing a typo was a public beating. Suddenly, proofreading feels luxurious. Historians agree Roman villas were micro-worlds of power, each master reigning like a small emperor, and in these miniature empires, female slaves occupy the lowest rung. They cook elaborate meals they'll never taste, sew fine tunics they'll never wear, and clean gardens they'll never stroll in. One scholar notes how letters from Roman wives casually complain about lazy slaves, as if human exhaustion were an inconvenience to the mistress's comfort. The irony? Some of these wives themselves grew up as slaves before marrying upward, now repeating the same cruelty. Social mobility in Rome wasn't about kindness. It was about climbing high enough to step on someone else. There's a peculiar fringe detail. In some wealthy households, masters forced female slaves to act as living decorations. They were dressed in fine robes, instructed to stand silently at banquets like ornaments, their presence a boast of wealth. Guests would sip wine and admire the silk without once acknowledging the trembling woman inside it. Think of it as human wallpaper, creepy, but very on brand for Rome's obsession with appearances. Domestic servitude isn't just physical, it's psychological. The slave learns to anticipate moods, to read a flicker of annoyance before it explodes. She memorizes her mistress's routines, her master's demands, the children's whims. Survival depends on invisibility, yet invisibility can't shield her from the darker demands. A master may call her into his chamber under the pretense of delivering wine. She knows what it means. Roman law offers no protection. In fact, jurists explicitly write that a slave's body belongs to her owner. Consent is irrelevant. Historians still argue whether this brutal truth was normalized in daily practice or more selective, but even the possibility kept fear constant. The household punishes mistakes with creativity. Whipping is common, but sometimes women are forced to wear humiliating signs. Thief, lazy, hung around their necks as they're paraded before other slaves. The goal is less about discipline, more about theater. Rome loves spectacle, even at the micro level of a kitchen. You can almost hear the master's voice. Let this be a lesson. Translation: let everyone watch her suffer so no one dares repeat it. Strangely, not every slave experience is identical. A lucky few are assigned to skilled domestic roles, scribes, tutors, or midwives. A Greek woman fluent in philosophy might become a teacher to her owner's children. But even in those cases, trust is an illusion. A single accusation, true or false, could drop her from tutor to scullery drudge overnight. Rome doesn't do job security. One debated point is whether mistresses were harsher than masters toward female slaves. Some historians argue Roman women, jealous or insecure, took out their frustrations on enslaved women, seen as rivals. Others claim the stereotype of the cruel mistress is exaggerated by male writers projecting misogyny. The truth likely wavers between stories. Some mistresses lashed out viciously, others treated slaves with a measured distance. But mercy was never the default setting. Even the youngest girls aren't spared. Children born into slavery inherit their mother's status automatically. The villa nursery is full of babies who will never be free, each one destined to serve the household that rocked them to sleep. Rome considers this efficient. The system replenishes itself. No need to buy more slaves if the household breeds its own. Cold arithmetic wrapped in lullabies. Still, resistance simmers in small ways. A misplaced key, watered-down wine, embroidery accidentally ruined. Petty sabotage passes for rebellion when larger revolts feel impossible. Imagine hiding the remote control from your boss every morning. Small acts of control matter, especially when they are the only control available. And yet, not every act of defiance ends quietly. A woman caught whispering plans of escape might be dragged into the atrium, stripped, and beaten before the household staff. Rome believes fear is contagious, spread it like perfume, and it lingers in every corner. The woman doesn't just suffer for herself, she becomes the cautionary tale. Still, some moments cut against the cruelty. Ancient graffiti shows that even in villas, slaves sometimes found laughter, carving jokes into walls about their master's bad habits. One scratched line reads like sarcasm, "Our Lord is wise, he lost at dice again." In those carved letters, you can almost hear a voice refusing silence. The walls remember even when history tries to forget. By the time the sun sets, the woman's body aches, her spirit thinner than parchment. She tucks herself into a corner on a rough mat, listening to footsteps echoing above. The villa sleeps comfortably, unaware that the very order they prize is bought with exhaustion and fear. And tomorrow? Tomorrow she'll rise again, trapped in the rhythm of endless service. But as the firelight dims, a question curls in the dark. If suffering fills even the private corners of a Roman villa, what horrors wait when that suffering is dragged into the public arena, transformed into entertainment for the masses? Mourning in Rome is loud, but the amphitheater is louder. The city loves its distractions, and nothing distracts like human misery packaged as entertainment. For enslaved women, humiliation isn't confined to kitchens and bedrooms. Sometimes it's dragged out into the blazing sun for everyone to see. And the crowd, packed shoulder to shoulder, doesn't see tragedy, they see a show. She's led through an underground passage that reeks of sweat, animals, and fear. Above, the crowd cheers for bread tossed from officials' hands. Down here, she shuffles in chains, her feet bleeding from stones. Romans perfected the art of turning punishment into theater. Think reality TV, except the elimination round involves actual elimination. The Colosseum looms as the infamous stage, though smaller arenas dot the empire. Some women are paraded as props during gladiatorial games. If condemned, they might be forced to reenact myths, chained as Andromeda, exposed to a staged sea monster. The monster might be fake, but the suffering is real. A quirky fringe tidbit. One historian claims some slaves were dressed in ridiculous costumes like birds with feathered hats before being executed, adding insult to injury. Scholars debate whether this was satire or sadism, but let's be honest, Rome didn't bother separating the two. Female slaves also bore punishments that combined public shame with practical cruelty. A runaway might be flogged in the Forum, her back striped red while merchants keep haggling over fish prices. The point wasn't just pain, it was advertisement. Rome's logic? Hurt one, control many. You might even say they invented influencer marketing, just with whips instead of hashtags. Not all punishments ended in blood. Some women were forced to carry heavy wooden yokes in the streets, marked with signs declaring their crime. Theft, laziness, or disrespect, all branded for public consumption. Children threw stones, men jeered, women whispered. The punishment outlasted the pain, because shame burns longer than stripes on skin. Historians still argue whether these rituals were more common in Rome itself or spread throughout the provinces, but the theatrical instinct seems universal across the empire. There's irony here. Rome, the civilization that built aqueducts, theaters, and law codes, treated suffering like a civic festival. Senators might debate morality in the morning, then gather to watch enslaved women humiliated by afternoon. That's the empire in miniature. Marble on the outside, rot in the foundation. One chilling spectacle involves the arena animals. Wild beasts imported from Africa, lions, leopards, even crocodiles are set loose against condemned slaves. The crowd roars, not because they hate the victim, but because they crave novelty. It's like binge-watching a show, always wanting the next shocking twist. The enslaved woman is never a person here, just a disposable plotline. A mainstream fact worth noting, Emperor Titus staged games that lasted 100 days, during which thousands of humans and animals died, many of them slaves. That's a Netflix season's worth of suffering in one imperial celebration. but cruelty wasn't always physical. Some punishments were designed as humiliating comedy. A woman accused of gossip might be shaved bald and paraded around the neighborhood. Another could be forced to serve food in chains during a feast, her clinking movements provoking laughter. For the elite, this wasn't punishment, it was entertainment between courses. A bitter modern aside, next time someone insists their office team-building exercise is humiliating, remind them at least no one made them wear an iron collar while serving hors d'oeuvres. Resistance, of course, could be met with fatal consequences. Some women caught plotting escape or rebellion were crucified. Crucifixion, Rome's favorite punishment, was more than execution. It was a billboard of fear. Bodies hung along roads for days, a grim reminder to travelers and slaves alike. Even here, historians argue, was crucifixion always the default punishment or reserved for extreme cases? Either way, the message was clear. Rome owned not just your body, but your death. And yet, small cracks of humanity flicker even in these arenas. Some spectators reportedly pitied the condemned, especially when women were forced into degrading roles. A few even whispered about the injustice, but pity never stopped the games. Empires don't thrive on compassion, they thrive on applause. The same crowd that sighed at a woman's suffering would cheer the next bloody spectacle without missing a beat. By nightfall, the arena floor is washed, the props cleared away. The enslaved woman who survives returns to her master's house, scarred and silent. For her, the arena isn't entertainment. It's a reminder she can be turned into a prop anytime. Her laughter, if it exists, happens in whispers with other slaves, mocking the absurd costumes, the ridiculous punishments. Humor becomes survival. If you can joke about being dressed as a bird before execution, you've stolen one tiny piece of dignity back. And so the line between private cruelty and public spectacle blurs. What happens in kitchens and courtyards spills into amphitheaters and forums, and what happens in arenas echoes back into villas. For enslaved women, humiliation is a cycle, each stage feeding the next. But as night settles over Rome and the games give way to silence, one question remains sharp and unanswered. If humiliation fuels the empire's appetite, what happens when the enslaved women themselves decide to feed that appetite with defiance, plotting rebellion under the cover of darkness? The silence of night in a Roman villa is deceptive. The marble halls seem still, but in the servants' quarters, whispers snake through the darkness. Women crouch near oil lamps, voices barely audible, plotting small acts that could ripple into something larger. Rome likes to believe slaves are obedient shadows. The truth? Shadows learn how to move unseen. Resistance wears many faces. Sometimes it's sabotage disguised as clumsiness, a pot of stew salted beyond recognition, a master's sandals hidden just before a banquet, a letter to a creditor misplaced at the bottom of a chest. Small annoyances, yes, but each one a quiet declaration that ownership can't erase wit. Historians note these everyday rebellions far more often than outright revolts, precisely because they're easier to hide. Yet, hidden or not, they carry the same core: defiance. For women, resistance can also take the form of secrets. A mistress's confidences overheard and shared, a guard's drunken boast remembered, a rival household's gossip repeated at the right moment. Knowledge, after all, is currency. And though Roman law strips women of power, information is one thing even chains can't cage. Some scholars argue whether women deliberately spread information to undermine households, or whether later writers just enjoyed dramatizing their cunning. But the possibility lingers like smoke, intangible, undeniable. Every so often, whispers swell into flames. Slave revolts punctuate Rome's history like jagged scars. The most famous, of course, is Spartacus's uprising in 73 BCE. Though led by gladiators, women marched alongside, cooking, tending wounds, and sometimes fighting themselves. Sources are murky. Historians still argue whether female slaves bore arms in significant numbers or stayed behind the lines, but the fear they inspired was undeniable. For the Senate, even the suggestion of women fueling rebellion was terrifying. If those deemed weakest could resist, what excuse remained for the strong? Quirky detail: Roman graffiti hints at women mocking their masters through coded jokes scratched into walls. One fragment discovered near Pompeii shows a sketch of a nobleman with donkey ears, captioned by a shaky hand that scholars suspect belonged to a slave. Imagine risking a beating for drawing your boss as Shrek. Humor wasn't just rebellion, it was survival art. Resistance also meant escape. Some women vanished into Rome's sprawling crowds, aided by sympathetic free poor or even fellow slaves. Runaway ads scratched on walls offer glimpses. Missing Syrian girl skilled in weaving, branded on the arm. These notices read eerily like missing pet posters, except the stakes were human lives. Catching a runaway often meant brutal punishment, but the fact so many risked it shows defiance was stronger than fear. But not all rebellion was clandestine. In some rare instances, women orchestrated open defiance inside the household. One account describes a group of enslaved women poisoning their mistress's wine, though whether it's true or Roman rumor remains uncertain. Another tale whispers of women refusing orders en masse, sitting silently until lashes forced them back to work. The details blur, but the undercurrent is clear. Silence itself could be resistance. What makes these stories remarkable isn't scale, it's audacity. Rome treated female slaves as expendable, yet they refused invisibility. A woman who swaps salt for sugar in her master's drink risks death for a joke. Another who shares news of a coming inspection destabilizes a household with a whisper. Against an empire of laws, chains, and soldiers, these acts are pebbles tossed at a fortress wall. But pebbles chip stone, given enough time. And sometimes rebellion took a quieter, spiritual form. Slaves clung to foreign gods, worshipping in secret. Syrian women prayed to Atargatis, Egyptians to Isis. These cults offered not just faith, but community, a sense that even in bondage they belonged to something greater. Roman officials viewed these gatherings with suspicion, fearing they seeded revolt. Historians still argue whether they were truly revolutionary or simply desperate comfort. Either way, the act of believing in another world was itself defiance against Rome's total control. The empire responded predictably with fear masked as brutality. Masters increased surveillance, forbade slaves from gathering, and punished rumor as harshly as theft. Some households forced slaves to inform on each other, fracturing solidarity. Yet even then, stories of small victories survive. An escaped woman hiding in the hills for months, a mistress embarrassed in front of guests by an intentional mistake. These aren't grand victories, but they echo louder than silence. Yet resistance wasn't always whispered in kitchens or scratched into walls. Sometimes it took form in the relationships enslaved women built with one another. Bonds of solidarity, sisters in labor, confidants in secrecy became shields against despair, sharing food scraps, warning each other of a master's temper, or covering mistakes so punishments fell lighter. These small gestures were acts of defiance too. Rome saw them as interchangeable property. They saw each other as lifelines. There were also rare, striking moments when enslaved women used the courts themselves. Roman law, twisted though it was, occasionally allowed slaves to testify under torture, and while this rarely brought freedom, it sometimes turned into leverage. A woman could, under questioning, expose her master's corruption or cruelty, planting seeds of scandal that might return to haunt him. Historians still argue whether these testimonies were genuine opportunities or simply another layer of abuse, but the possibility that a slave's voice could dent a master's reputation shows resistance wasn't confined to shadows. Some even carved legacies through their children. Though Roman law declared the offspring of enslaved women would remain slaves, women still passed down songs, stories, and languages smuggled from their homelands. In doing so, they defied the empire's attempt to erase them. The act of teaching a child a lullaby in a forbidden tongue was rebellion disguised as tenderness, and so resistance was not always loud or triumphant. It was often quiet, patient, persistent. Rome's power was overwhelming, but it was never absolute. In every villa, in every corner of the empire, enslaved women found ways, however small, to assert that they were more than property. The tension between domination and resistance defines Rome's domestic heartbeat. Every act of cruelty begets an act of defiance. Every punishment feeds resentment. And though rebellions like Spartacus's ultimately failed, their memory gnawed at Rome's confidence. Behind every chained woman's silence was the potential for noise. By the dim light of dawn, whispers fade. Slaves rise to work again, their secret resistance tucked beneath weary faces. The villa resumes its rhythm. The empire continues its march. Yet the question lingers in the hush between tasks. If women could resist in kitchens, courtyards, and fields, what legacy remains when the empire itself begins to fracture and their voices risk vanishing into history's cracks? Time wears empires down, even ones that imagine themselves eternal. Rome's dominance begins to falter, not in a single collapse, but in slow cracks that widen over centuries. Grain shipments fail, soldiers desert, emperors multiply and die too quickly. And in that unraveling, the world of slavery also shifts. For the enslaved women who once scrubbed marble floors and stood trembling in markets, the empire's decline is not a sudden liberation. It is a fading, a slow erasure, where their lives slip between the cracks of history. Christianity creeps into Rome's heart, first whispered in catacombs, then shouted in basilicas. Its doctrines condemn certain cruelties, at least in theory. Masters are urged to treat slaves with mercy, though the institution itself persists. For enslaved women, this new faith offers solace, the promise that in another world, the last shall be first. Yet historians still argue whether Christianity softened their daily burdens or merely sanctified the same chains with holier words. Faith doesn't clean the kitchens, faith doesn't stop the lash, but faith does give hope, and sometimes that was enough to survive. Laws shift too. By the late empire, manumission freeing a slave becomes increasingly common. Some women, through years of loyal service or manipulation of household politics, manage to secure their freedom. A freed woman could even carve out a modest life, running a shop or marrying into lower free ranks. But freedom is uneven. For every woman granted release, countless more remain bound. The imbalance itself becomes another cruelty, dangling possibility just out of reach. Mainstream fact: Emperor Constantine issued edicts that restricted certain brutal punishments against slaves. No longer could masters casually kill without consequence. But this wasn't moral awakening, it was political calculation. A dwindling population needed bodies, even enslaved ones, to keep the machine running. Mercy, when it came, was often just economics wearing a kind mask. Still, fragments of individual voices survive. A tomb inscription remembers Aurelia, freed woman, beloved for her skill in weaving and her kindness. Another recalls a Syrian woman faithful in service. These scraps are all that remain, the echoes of women who lived whole lives yet left only carved stone behind. They are reminders that every statistic millions enslaved was once a breathing body with jokes, sorrows, and whispered rebellions. A quirky detail: some late Roman households reportedly used charms and amulets to bind their slaves spiritually, a superstition meant to prevent escape. Imagine shackles forged not of iron, but of magic words etched onto lead tablets. Did it work? Unlikely. But it reveals the desperation of masters who sensed control slipping. When laws, whips, and markets fail, fear turns mystical. The erasure of these women is as telling as their presence. Their labor built the villas, their suffering fed the arenas, their resistance whispered through the centuries. Yet their names vanish. Rome's great historians Tacitus Livy, Suetonius barely mention them, too busy cataloging emperors and battles. The silence is its own violence. What remains are fragments, hints, possibilities debated by modern scholars who still ask, how much agency did they wield? How deep did their resistance cut? And how many stories are simply lost, swallowed by centuries of indifference? As Rome buckles under barbarian invasions, famine, and corruption, the system of slavery doesn't vanish, it mutates. Enslaved women blur into serfs, bound to land instead of masters, still trapped but under a different vocabulary. Freedom doesn't arrive like dawn, it drips, uneven and uncertain, across centuries. For those women, history doesn't close with triumph, but with disappearance, their suffering absorbed into new systems, their laughter faint echoes in ruins. And yet, even in silence, they leave something behind. The persistence of their memory, fragile as it is, insists that cruelty cannot fully erase humanity. Their jokes on walls, their whispered prayers, their stubborn survival remind us that even in the most brutal structures, resistance flickers. Rome collapses, emperors fade, but those flickers remain. By the time the empire crumbles in the West, their voices have already thinned into dust. Still, one unanswered question lingers, carrying into the present. If their stories could vanish so easily, how many others across all times, all empires have also been lost, waiting for someone to remember? The noise of Rome has been relentless chains rattling in markets, punishments echoing in villas, crowds roaring in arenas. But now, as the story reaches its close, those sounds soften. Imagine them fading one by one like torches guttering out in a long corridor. The markets grow quiet, the amphitheaters stand empty, and the villas lie in ruins. What remains is the memory of women who once lived inside those spaces, their suffering etched invisibly into the stones. Their stories are fragile, scattered across tomb inscriptions, fragments of graffiti, and rare mentions in legal texts. Most names are lost, but traces linger. A Syrian girl who once wove fine cloth, a Greek tutor who whispered poetry to children, an African woman forced to stand silently as living decor at a feast. These fragments are threads, and when tied together, they form a tapestry of resilience. Rome tried to define them as property, but history betrays the truth. They were people who endured, resisted, and carried fragments of dignity even in chains. It is easy, in looking back, to imagine only their pain. But pain was not the whole of them. There was humor, even if hidden, scratched into walls in crude drawings that mocked their masters. There was love, even if forbidden, whispered in lullabies taught to children who would never be free. There was faith, clung to in secret, whether in Roman gods or foreign cults, each prayer an act of hope against hopelessness. In these moments, they refused to be erased. Scholars still argue about the details, how much freedom they could carve, how far their resistance reached, how many revolts they joined. But debates don't change the truth that they existed, and their endurance was its own defiance. Rome's grandeur may have rested on their backs, but they never became what the empire wanted: silent tools. Even silence, when chosen, carried weight. Now, picture the ruins as they stand today. Tourists wander through the Colosseum, posing for photographs in the shadow of arches once stained with blood. Ivy coils over fallen stones. A cracked mosaic catches the light of the sun. These places look timeless, but they are haunted. The ghosts of the women who walked barefoot across those floors linger in the quiet. You cannot hear their voices, but the stones carry their echoes. Let your breathing slow. Let the story itself blur at the edges. The violence, the humiliation, the punishments, they are no longer vivid. Instead, focus on the persistence of life, the small sparks that endured. Even in bondage, they laughed, prayed, whispered secrets, sabotaged meals, and passed down songs. They lived as more than Rome ever admitted, and that reminder carries forward, gently but firmly, into the present. Rest with that thought. Empires collapse, laws change, names vanish, but the resilience of the human spirit never fades entirely. Those women are long gone, but the memory of their struggle lingers like embers, glowing faintly in the ashes of history. As the final image softens, let yourself drift. The empire has crumbled, the chains are broken, the voices are quiet. All that remains is the gentle hush of memory, soothing now, inviting you into calm. And tomorrow, in the soft dark of another night, a new story waits, another forgotten corner of history ready to whisper itself into your dreams.